Start.
Start. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Tom Nardi.
This is episode 270, a cluster of microcontrollers, a rocket engine from scratch, and a look inside Voyager. This week in Hackaday news, we started up the business card challenge this week on Tuesday. If you haven't seen it yet, you should go check out the post about it. We linked in a bunch of fun business card projects that other people have done, and even more people chimed in the comments about other business card projects that we should have put in our list of inspiring examples. So definitely go check those out as well. This is one of those where it's basically a form factor challenge, right? It's do the coolest thing you can in something that's, the size of a business card and maybe even kind of inexpensive enough that you can hand them out to people as if they were business cards.
Well, that's the real trick, right?
Therein lies the rub. Yeah, this is one of those fast, cheap, good. You don't have to take all of them, right? You can pick one or two of the aspects to work on.
And I think, to be fair, the rules don't specify they have to be cheap enough to hand out, right? That's your
absolutely
own
not.
Yeah, if it's worth it to you, you can hand them out at whatever cost they are.
The business card is your guiding light here, right? They're cheap, they're this size, they're thin, they say something about you. That's kind of what you're aiming at. I actually went and looked at how thick a business card was, and I don't expect anyone to make these in the 0.2 millimeter thick size, but maybe someone will. What do I know?
I think it's gonna be a really cool one. I think it's a great form factor. We've done the square inch and that kind of thing, which are really kind of pushing the boundaries. But this is, I think, a reasonable amount of space for a lot of cool stuff. Like you said, we've had all kinds of examples in the past. From retro computers this size to, I'm sure, at least a couple business cards that booted Linux over the years, right? So,
right, yeah,
there's a lot of really cool prior art, and I'm definitely excited to see this one. It's almost, I'm almost surprised we haven't done this before, right? This is the first one.
Yeah, as far as I know.
This seems like one of the ones we would have done once we saw somebody booting Linux on their business card,
Yeah, no, this has been one of those long running hacks that people have done forever and ever. I remember, oh man, I don't even have this in here. There was a business card that would plug in. It was made out of thick enough PCB material. It would plug into the USB port directly.
Oh, yeah.
God, there's all sorts of awesome hacks here. I want to see somebody trying to make it thin, do that trick where you mill out a space that's exactly the same size as your OLED screen or something and fit that inside the board. We'll see.
Right. That was the whole thing Kevin Bates did that then started the Arduino, right? When he first did it, it was meant to be a playable business card, and that was the trick. He routed out the space around the microcontroller and stuff to get it real thin. And people started saying, "Hey, this would be kind of cool. Could you make more of these?" And it turned into, I'm pretty sure, his full-time gig now. So who knows, what your next hack might turn into.
Super excited to see these start coming in. A bunch of people in the comments have said, yeah, they're going to start on this right now.
I think, for the record, we already have a half a dozen entries as we're recording this, so that's a good sign.
Wasting no time. That's awesome. That makes me very happy. What's up, sound?
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
Is this a guessing, or do we get to reveal?
This is a reveal week. I mean, you still have to guess.
I still have to, suffer through. Okay, let me download that.
For those of you playing along at home, the game here is we play a mystery sound, you try to guess it, and we pick among the correct answers randomly, and the winner gets a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. Extremely limited edition, although now that we've done I don't know what, 100 What's That Sound challenges, that's a lot of t-shirts out there, I think.
Okay, I'm listening. Somebody being beaten up in exchange for coins.
That's what Christina said too, essentially. I don't know which game she said anymore. Some N64 game.
Yeah, I don't even have a game in mind, but it definitely sounds like punching something and, coins falling out of them. I couldn't even begin on this one.
What if I said that isn't punching, but more
It's like a swooping?
swooping? Yeah,
Swooping?
yeah.
Mhm.
Possibly flapping.
Flapping. This segment reminds me that I perhaps didn't play as many games as I thought I had back in the day.
This one's a cell phone game.
Oh, it's a cell phone game. Oh, well, that's... Is it the bird? Is it, the Flappy Bird?
It is the bird, the Flappy Bird.
Oh, okay. At least
There you go.
Is there coins or whatever in Flappy Bird? I don't.
It makes that coin noise every time you pass through a gate.
Really?
It's just a generic you got a point noise, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know. I must have played the game. I mean, I'm familiar. I think everybody in the world who was alive during that period is familiar with it, but I'm trying to think if I actually ever played it.
I know it more from rip-offs of the game than from the actual game itself.
Oh, wait, now it's coming back to me, because I think there was some debate that they had ripped off, like, the Mario noise.
Oh, the Mario sound. Yeah, that might be
And I
the
think they got
Mario
in trouble
coin
for
noise.
it, because they had, or something like that. They just pulled, like, stock sounds and stuff. Like the development of Flappy Bird, I know, is, like, its own
There
story.
is a whole saga behind Flappy Bird, which includes it became hyper popular, and then I think a few months later, the guy who wrote it was like, "This is crazy. I'm pulling the game," and he pulled it off the market entirely. And whether that was because of some copyright issue or whatever, I don't know. But then there were like millions of Flappy Bird clones out there after that, and Apple Store stopped allowing any other apps to use Flappy in the name. Like just blanket. No more apps for Flappy.
I think for a brief time, there was even people selling phones that still had it installed. Like if you had grabbed it before it went down, they were like on eBay for,
Exactly. For like
pre-banned
hundreds of dollars.
Flappy phone.
Anyway, Flappy Bird it is, and this was one of the weeks where we got almost exclusively right answers. We got 36 answers, of which 32 are correct. And the astute of you out there might notice that 32 is one of those 5-bit numbers. So it's an exactly even power of 2 number, and that means that I have to flip a coin to figure out who the winner is, which is the most excruciating way, but it's only 5 flips. So here we go. And the coin actually, the randomest coin on my desk. And the coin is a custom coin made by Kenneth Finnegan. He made a whole bunch of these and was just handing them out at SuperCon a couple years ago. One side it says, "Make something cool," and the other side says, "No cash value. In your imagination we trust."
Oh, yeah, I think I got one of those too. Now you mention it. That sounds very familiar.
One of Kenneth's maker coins. So make is a 1 and ball of yarn is a 0. Here goes the flip. We got a 0. 0. Uh-oh. Looking good, low number, people. 0. Wait a second. This is creeping me out.
Perfectly random numbers.
This is a bad coin. Here we go. 0, ladies and gentlemen. And if this one comes up 0, I'm freaking out. 0. I am officially freaking out.
All right, it's time to figure out if it's weighted.
I'm going to flip this again a couple times just to see. If this never comes up, how is it possible that... Oh, there you go. There's a 1. So congratulations, number 0. That would be Caro, the first person who got an answer, and it's Flappy Bird. Absolutely correct. Other awesome nicknames include Wasted Hours in 2013.
2013, oh man.
Which must be Flappy Bird era.
That counts as like a retro game now, right?
I think it does. Flapmaster Flex. We got Snuggly Cactus. That's a good name. Flappyleptic Intergalactic and High Impedance Air Gap. That's a good nickname. I Want That T-shirt is also a good nickname. Bummer about the random numbers. Congratulations one more time to Caro. I'll be getting you a T-shirt, and the rest of you tune in next week. We'll do this again. My first hack this week comes from BitLooney. This is a 256-core RISC-V mega cluster. And this is a hilarious project. He started this last year, and I actually remember him showing me the prototype of this at the Berlin Hackaday Europe event last year. His idea was he wanted to use those 10-cent microcontrollers, the super cheap CH32V003s. And he's like, well, they're so cheap, I'll just make a board with like 16 of them on it in a 4x4 grid. And I'm like, okay, well, that's crazy. And he's like, well, yeah, and look, and each one has its own LED. And so each microcontroller can basically blink its own LED. And he called this board with 16 of them on it the supercluster and broke out communications so you could talk to these things. What's cooler than a supercluster? Well, of course, a mega cluster. And so what he wants to do is take then 16 of these 16 boards and put them all together in an array. And he's not quite there yet, but he's making good progress. And that would be the mega cluster. His interim step here is the cluster blade, which has a separate microcontroller, slightly more powerful. This is the CH32V203. Separate microcontroller on those that controls each one of the 16 microcontroller superclusters, and then they are all on a common backbone and talk to each other that then talk to yet another microcontroller that does the USB to hopefully run this whole thing. And if this sounds crazy to you, just to blink a whole bunch of LEDs, well, I think you're correct. But what this does is it means that he has to think up this kind of relatively fast data interconnect and bus between all of these tons of little microcontrollers. And that's, I think, what's really cool about this project. If you look at his blade boards, it's got two plug-in slots where you can plug in these 16, these 4x4 microcontroller boards, but then it's also broken out all of the GPIOs. And there's just this like huge, must be, I don't know, 40, 80, 100 GPIOs dangling off the side of this thing. And then this times 8, it's an insane device. In the process, he screwed up the bus, and his original architecture was a command line and then a clock line and then an 8-bit wide data line. So 8 lines for data. Clock and data is pretty obvious, but the command line was going to say, strobe down when it's time for you to start listening. And he forgot the command line on one of the buses, and so he had to nix that whole thing, which then meant he had to figure out how to make the buses work without the command line. And so his strategy is to just idle the clock high. And so basically, no clock line means nothing's going on, so you can talk on the bus. And then once the clock line starts firing away and data starts getting sent across, all of the microcontrollers have to not send and just kind of be quiet and listen so that the intended addressed microcontroller can receive its data. The trick here is that the individual microcontrollers might want to randomly start talking on the bus. And so he had to figure out this whole collision detection system. And that's what kind of fully half of this video is about, is once you've decided to make a 256 microcontroller, super microcontroller computer, whatever the heck, how do you then do the decollision and stuff like that? And it's really kind of neat. His approach is, the usual to say, if I pull this line down, does it change state? And if it doesn't, then you think somebody else is using it. So that gives you part of it. Each packet has the address device. I guess it has the source address, the target address, and then the data. And then at the end, he puts on a checksum. So you can see if some other microcontroller has played with the line during the course of the transmission as well. I don't know. This is the kind of mess you get into when you do massively parallel systems. And I think it's really cool that by having kind of 10-cent microcontrollers, he can get into this mess on the dirt cheap. This is an incredibly cheap project in a way to get this deep into the weeds with a 256-way addressable system and all that mess. So it's really cool that he's hacking his way through these problems, but on a on a kind of affordable, if slightly crazy scale.
Well, that's kind of funny because it's sort of like what we saw. I don't know, it doesn't seem as popular now, but for a while people were doing a lot of Raspberry Pi clusters to do low cost experimentation with stuff that would otherwise be, tough to pull off without a data center in the basement, load balancing and failover and stuff. And nobody was really saying it was a great idea to use a bunch of Raspberry Pis for this, but it did give you that hands-on experience, right? And it was better than just reading about it or having to simulate it. You had real hardware talking to each other over the line. So it is kind of an extension of that, taken even to the next level, with even greater numbers and at significantly lower cost, which is really cool. like you said, if you look at the project, it really is about the bus and their communication. I mean, even like this video, I think more than half of it is just talking about the communications, right? Because there's not a whole lot to say about each individual little board. You know, it's a microcontroller, it's an LED, and we kind of know about. We're kind of familiar with that thing, that sort of thing around here. But then from there is where it gets tricky. So it is a really cool look at these massively parallel communications and the weeds you can get caught up in. I for one love, he has the little display of them all blinking but out of sync, which looks so cool, and like that 50s sci-fi, what a supercomputer was supposed to look like. I know the easier way, if you want to do this for your own home lab, is definitely just to get blinking LEDs and let them fall out of sync. But if you want to do it the really hard way, this is a more impressive way to get that lighting effect, at least.
I wonder if it ends up being cheaper though. Like, I mean,
it might be.
These are the bizarrest turn of events, right? Like, these are 10-cent microprocessors driving the LED. You can use a regular LED, so that's like 1 cent, and then this 10-cent microcontroller, you have to program it somehow and figure that whole jig out. Is a blinking LED, does a regular bog standard blink LED cost 10 cents? Because if it does, might even be cheaper. That's crazy. What the heck is he going to do with it? They don't have that much processing power each, but, you certainly could do, that many PWM channels dirt cheap and easy. Or how many serial, this is an N-way serial adapter or something. 256 serial ports. It would be like, this would be phenomenally useful back in the 1990s.
Yeah, right.
I have no idea what you could do with this, but, I think we're going to see. Yeah, so keep your eyes on this one.
Well, this is a topic that has come up quite a bit, I would say, over the years, but is maybe starting to reach a bit of a boil. The title here is, How Does the Raspberry Pi Rack Up Against a Mini PC? This is a look at the current state of affairs between the Pi 5 and the new mini computers that are running Intel's N100 processor family. And it's kind of an interesting thing where, the Pi got popular arguably because it was cheap and small, right? And history was made, like we started seeing it and everything. While the Pi hasn't gotten bigger over the years, it's definitely gotten a lot more expensive. So what started as 25 or 35, originally, is now, I mean, you can spend like $80 on one of these things depending on how much RAM you want. So the Pi has gotten more expensive, while at the same time, some of these x86 processors have gotten cheaper and smaller and less, power hungry. So you're getting at this point where now you have kind of a real decision to make, at least in some applications. Does the Pi still make sense? If you can deal with something that's maybe, 50% larger, let's say, it's not like it's double or triple the size anymore. It's a little bit bigger and maybe takes a little bit more power, but it's going to be way more capable in terms of what you can hook up to it and performance and, well, everything, what kind of software you can even run on it, right? You don't have to jump through those ARM hoops, right? It's a good look. This is from the CNX software, so they do a really good job with benchmarking and kind of taking it like a scientific approach. And to no one's surprise, like the Intel chip blows away the Pi in almost all the benchmarks, right? The Intel N100, it should be said, is like the pokiest of pokey x86 chips. It's like made to be a low end. I guess it would be even like below the Celeron, or maybe is the Celeron now turned into this, or I don't know what Intel's current naming scheme is, but I know this is definitely below the i3. Is made for weird little applications like this and Chromebooks and that kind of thing. So it's about as close as you're going to get, I suppose, in terms of a fair fight between the Pi and an Intel processor. I think this is one of those ones where there's probably no right or wrong answer. It's going to really depend on what your use case is. And for me, I thought one of the reasons this was interesting is because there's so many of the comments, right? Like we always talk about, the comments are sometimes the most interesting parts of the article, and you had a lot of people weighing in on what they do with these boards and what's important to them and why one thing will work and the other one won't. And it really just does come down to, like, what are you trying to do in a lot of these cases? If you're trying to, run your own web server, then, the days of a Pi in a box may be over, right? Like, it might make more sense to get one of these Intel machines. And yeah, you're going to pay a little bit more, but you're going to have 16 gigs of RAM, and you're going to have regular off-the-shelf drives you can plug into it without jumping through any hoops, and that's obviously has big value for doing a server or something like that. Whereas a lot of people make the argument that, hey, the GPIO is the most important thing to them, and in that case, then it doesn't really matter how cheap the Intel box is, it still doesn't have that header on the back that is in such high demand. So I don't think there'll ever be a winner. I think it's always going to depend on the application, but it is very interesting that there's certainly more choices now. And I think it's probably fair to say that the days of like the Pi being your only practical choice are kind of over, right? I think there are definitely a lot of options now, which I think is probably for the benefit of the community.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I came out of this with the conclusion that these are kind of two entirely different products. I think he's kind of comparing apples and oranges here in a way. Like the Pi is kind of it's a single board computer, it's bare bones, it has real-time GPIOs broken out. It's a lot cheaper, at least, before you buy all the other things you need to make it run, like power supply and so on. In that sense, it's half the price, but it's also half the compute speed. It's a lot less memory. But on the other side, then it's half the power consumption, right? The CPU's running at about half the speed. And so I don't know. I mean, are these the same thing in the end, or are these kind of aiming at different markets entirely? And I think that's kind of, at least for the Hackaday crowd, where the Pi and the other single board Linux computers have kind of slotted in, is that they have a bunch of GPIOs you can use. And so if you want to turn it into an arcade box, you just connect wires from joystick switches directly onto the board and you're set. And that, for instance, you couldn't do with this thing. But then like your example where you're running a web server, for instance, yeah, get a real computer for that. Don't bother with the Pi for that. You'll have a much easier time fitting, a big hard drive in there and all the rest. I don't know. I kind of left this surprised that there was any overlap, and there is a little actually. It's funny. Some of the benchmarks were kind of close, like the 7-zip one, the SSL benchmark was actually in the Pi's favor, even though it's running at half the speed, but that's because it has a hardware accelerated SSL processor on it. On the other hand, the other, the various computers they looked at had, video encoding, hardware video encoding stuff that will make that run a lot better. They got H.265 and not just H.264 like the Pi does. And so if that's something you care about, then that's the choice to make. My takeaway from this is these are still two totally different things. Pi 5 is maybe a better experimenter platform, whatever, and the little computers are better little computers.
I suppose that could be the headline. Yeah, right. Little computers are good little computers. But yeah, you definitely, it does depend on, like, if you're going to build a robot or something, then it'd be an obvious choice. You want the Pi 5 for all the I/O and stuff. But I mean, we definitely have seen a lot of people trying to push the Pis, and not even the 5, right? They've been doing this since they came out, trying to push them into various like server applications or like doing network attached storage with them, and really pushing them into applications they definitely weren't made for. If that's your goal, like if you want to do a network attached storage, like you can do it with a Pi 5, and we've covered how to hook up, now you can do the NVMe drives and that kind of stuff, and you can make it work. But I think you have to ask yourself why, when there are more obvious platforms coming up on the market now. But yeah, like you said, if you're looking to experiment, then that's a whole different thing. And you could argue that was always the goal with the Raspberry Pi, right? Like from day one, it always had the GPIO because they wanted it to be an educational platform that you could hook up to stuff and do things you couldn't do on a regular computer. So that's never going to go away. I would hope, right? Like that's always going to be kind of a driving force behind the future versions of the hardware.
Well, my next hack is BluePad32 brings all the controllers to your MCU, and this one you wrote up, and I love the choice here. This is a hack by Ricardo Quesada. This targets game controllers and tries to make them useful in a microcontroller project environment, and it works with a ton of different Bluetooth-based controllers and a ton of different microcontrollers. So no matter whether you have an Xbox and you want to get it working with an Arduino, or you have a PS5 controller and you want to get it working with your Pico wireless, or if you have an old PS2 and you want to get it working with an ESP32, you can do that. So head on over to his GitHub and you can see the list of all of the controllers that this works with and the microcontrollers that it works with. It's really quite fantastic. And I totally agree with your write-up here, Tom, which is that the design of the kind of physical input, the controller part of it, is really hard for us hacker people. Here we are with like the perfect multi-dimensional, how many axes do you have on one of these things? The perfect like multi-dimensional, nice form factor, fits great in your hands, very responsive thing to do the driving for you. And if only we could integrate that better into our projects. And I think that's basically it here, right? Like if you have a project that needs you to remote control it, then this is the solution for you. And I think that's just tremendously powerful.
Nintendo and Sony and Microsoft, they've spent millions of dollars and decades of research and development to get where they are with their respective controllers, and regardless like what camp you are in terms of, your home console, no one's debating the controllers aren't awesome. Right,
That's right.
That's not part of like the console war, right? Like everybody pretty much agrees these are great input devices, and it's taken a long time to get here, but it's still the same kind of, this is where the sticks are, this is where the buttons are, because it works and it's comfortable, and there are such things as solved problems, right? Listen, if you want to make your own controller for your own stuff, that's more power to you. But if you just want to move something around, your time would probably be better spent taking a controller that's literally on the shelf at pretty much any store, and using a library like this and making it work. And also mice and keyboards too. So it's really a one-stop shop kind of thing. If you have something that has Bluetooth on it and you want to talk to it, this is definitely the library to check out.
And look, these are Bluetooth in the end, so like you don't even have to cut the wires and not use it for your PS5 anymore. This is really just the same thing as, I'm going to use this to run my robot now. Now I'm going to go back to gaming with it. Like you don't even have to give the thing up. You don't even have to buy an extra one if you've got a controller kicking around.
Well, from game controllers to, well, I guess still game controllers. This next one is put more Cori in your flight sim switches. And Cori, for those who don't know, and I'm included, is a manufacturer of switches and indicator lights that are actually used in proper aircraft. And this is an attempt to kind of recreate those by SL3 simulations at a reasonable human price. These things, as you can imagine, are ridiculously expensive. These, they're multi-position switches with indicator lights in them and little annunciators that tell you what's wrong and that kind of thing. And I'm sure each one probably costs as much as my car if you're getting them for your 747. The attempt here is to recreate the look using a 3D printed body and kind of off-the-shelf components, and the finished result is just phenomenal. I mean, there's a picture here at the top of the page, and I honestly couldn't tell you if that's a real airplane or the simulator.
Exactly.
I mean, they look incredible. And there's nothing, once it's cracked open and you look inside, there's really no magic to it. I mean, I'd imagine, obviously, the real one's way more complicated. But in this case, I mean, it's a 3D printed body. It's got kind of a two-compartment design in there so that you can have an LED in each side. The idea here with most of these is there's a lit label for what the thing is, and then a indicator under it that will light up when it's on, or obviously go off when it's off. So you have kind of a steady light on the top. The light on the bottom goes on and off depending on the status, and the top one stays on. So that each one has two LEDs. It has a latching switch. It's got a resistor on a little custom circuit board, and not a whole lot else. I mean, it is pretty remarkable for what the final result looks like. How simplistic it is inside, and I think the benefit is really that it's a lot of work has been put into figuring out how to simplify this as much as possible. Right? I would say if there's any secret sauce here, it's in the actual labels that go on top of it. Because I mean, the switch is an off-the-shelf switch. It's LEDs, resistor. You print the body, whatever. Probably the trickiest part is that there's a laser cut, real thin acrylic sheet that goes on top of the LEDs, but below like this filter material, so that you have this nice backlit text. And if there's anything that's going to be tricky to recreate, it'll be that, right? You need at least some kind of a laser. I think he does use a CO2 laser. Clear stuff is always tough to do on a diode laser, so you might have to have at least like a K40 or something to pull that off. But other than that, the lighted switch and like the two position thing is very easy to recreate. So I mean, for me, when I saw this, it did kind of make me. I yearned to have something that needed lighted multi-position switches. Like once I saw how I could recreate this, and I'm like, I could do this too. And it's not nearly as hard or as expensive as I would have thought. Huge help for making simulators or even just cool looking front panels for your regular electronic gadgets.
And my last hack this week is going to be a quick and dirty hack, or at least a dirty hack. This is Robotic Platform Turns Shop Vac into Roomba by Clay Builds. This is the MOAR, the mother of all Roombas. He takes a 4 horsepower shop vac from Harbor Freight and puts it on wheels and has it drive around and attempts to make it into a Roomba clone so that it can clean up in his workshop. One of the restrictions here is that he doesn't modify the vacuum cleaner at all, so it slips into kind of this, I don't know what, laser cut plywood frame that he has built for it out of wood and threaded rods to make the brackets. And then the motors that drive this thing are windshield wiper motors that run some wheels that I guess were meant for wheelbarrows or something that he also picked up at Harbor Freight. By the way, just as an aside, if you want to dig more into using windshield wiper motors for your projects, we have a great video that I'll link in the show notes to a Wiper Motor 101. This is Daniel Simu's project. Really, really cool. But back to this one, the real trick here, if you want an autonomous Roomba that's based on a shop vac, the shop vac, of course, plugs into the wall, right? But this thing needs to run on batteries. And so he's got an inverter to run the shop vac off of a fairly beefy, but as he describes it, fairly sketchy e-bike battery pack. He's made little containers for all of this in his laser cut wooden frame. It's really kind of nice. The fun part is the collision detector on the front, which he's made up of basically a bent coat hanger that, because it's bent, has a little bit of tension pulling itself down. It pulls on a fishing line, and that's connected to a micro switch. So when it bumps into something, the coat hanger goes up, the fishing line goes slack, and the micro switch goes click, and it can tell it's hit something. It works for, straight on hits. It's a little bit sketchy for sideways hits. Oh, yeah. Oh, and he uses originally a PS2 controller here. Unfortunately, it's wired. He doesn't do the wireless trick, which I guess PS2 wasn't wireless anyway, but further generations were. So he drives this thing around before he gets it running, quote, autonomously. If anything, this kind of really makes you appreciate the Roomba for its simplicity of design. I mean, it's the dumbest robot in the universe. It's just got a bumper on the front, and when it hits the bumper, it backs off, it turns, it goes somewhere else. And he does replicate that navigation mode with his, but this is where you understand that the Roomba is designed like it was in a circle where fully the whole front half of it was the bumper, right? Like it can't miss any of the wall bumps, and it doesn't have wheels that stick out on the sides and stuff. And these are the places where Clay runs into trouble with his build. Like, the wheels are chonky and they get caught on things, and sometimes the wheel hits a wall first before the bumper does, and it kind of has to slide around and stuff. And then the end of this one, I think, is the smoke coming out of the load resistors. And this part I'm not sure I fully understood, but he didn't want to tax the battery too much, and he didn't want to tax the kind of crappy inverter he got to turn the battery's 48 volts into 110 AC. And so he put a bunch of, I guess, 6 ohm resistors in line in between the battery and the inverter to keep it from, to kind of throttle it, to keep it from putting too much current across. And that seems like a horrible idea to me. And indeed, these 6 ohm resistors got smoking hot and started burning the plastic container, or at least smoldering the plastic container that they were enclosed in. And it kind of half works, this one. But the nice thing is, as he says, that, everything was designed to be completely non-destructive to the shop vac. And actually, if he wanted to, he could, just unscrew everything and return it to Harbor Freight. No damage done.
For anyone who's gone to Harbor Freight, that's really the key. They have a remarkable return policy. So, like, no matter what you've done to the thing, if you can bring it back in one piece, they'll pretty much give you another one or store credit or something. My father gets like the cheap drills from there, burns them out doing God knows what he does with them, and then just brings it back and says, I don't know. The drill burned out. Can I have another one? And he's on like the 6th, so yeah, the drill is only $20, but they keep giving you more of them, so it's fine.
That's horrible.
No, this is a really cool build. I mean, what you said about the bumper, you really got to take a look at this if you're just listening. The wheels stick out like significantly more than the bumper, so like you can see anytime it goes past like a corner or something, or even in the video, it's a pretty small room and it manages to get stuck on stuff even in that situation, because there'll be things like a garbage can that it rolls right by because it doesn't hit the bumper, but then the wheel smashes right into it. It's not an ideal situation. It does remind me of like there was those robot kits back in like the 90s and the early 2000s that had called it like a mouse or something, and it had a similar like whisker arrangement where there was 2 bent wires and they were on micro switches, and there was a left and a right, and then when the one hit, that turned that motor off and it turned it the other way. And I almost wonder if that would work better. Instead of like one big crash bar in the front, if it was segmented and he had a left and a right that extended beyond the wheels, something like that.
I have to say, he runs into like all the classic early robot problems here, like the one where the bump sensor doesn't work the way you think it's going to. He has a bit of the video where the thing is canyoning, which is an absolute classic, where, it bumps into one wall, it turns around, it bumps into the opposite wall parallel to it, and it gets caught in this part of his kitchen where it's a little bit tight, and it's just going boing, 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 boing from one side of the wall to the other. These are absolutely classic problems, and, with this kind of classic style shape form factor robot, he's running into them, only it's, 10 times bigger than it should be and trailing around a shop vac. Fun to watch.
All right, well, this last one for me, I am jealous that Al Williams found this one and wrote it up before me. Although not hugely surprised. Al does certainly have his ear to the ground for this kind of aerospace stuff. But this one is called Building a Rocket Engine from Scratch. What's really cool about this is actually article, or almost like a diary, maybe you could almost say, written by Ryan Kunn, which is an engineer for ABL Space Systems, which, if you're not a rocket nerd like me, they're developing their own small launcher, like a lot of companies right now, and they have, as far as I know, not reached orbit yet, but they have launched a rocket. There's those couple early rockets that don't get very far, right? So this is a legit rocket company. They have a rocket, they've flown it, they're hoping to make orbit. They have like a launch plan for this year, at least one. So this is not like somebody in the backyard's rocket engineering. This is a proper space startup. And what I thought was just really cool was just how transparent this is obviously there's parts in there where Ryan will say, like, listen, I can't say exactly how we solve this problem, right? Because they are competing with, a lot of these other new space startups, and there are some things you want to kind of keep close to the vest. But, like SpaceX has always been really transparent when compared to like the traditional aerospace company, which is to say a black box, right? So like when we saw anything from behind the scenes at SpaceX, it was very exciting. And then like Rocket Lab kind of followed suit, and they were kind of like being a little bit more relaxed. But as far as I know, there's like never been anything like this where it has actually been like pictures from the shop floor and like talking about like the mistakes they made and the things that didn't work and what did work and like their process. Like this is really if you're into, the modern, new space competition and stuff, this is just an incredible insight into how it's actually happening on like a day-to-day level. And I would go as far as to say there's probably nothing that like the average Hackaday reader could directly use from this write-up. I mean, this is proper go to space stuff, but there is certainly like conceptual stuff about making assumptions before you start building hardware and that kind of thing that is a little bit more down to earth, if you can forgive the forgive the pun. Like for example, they talk about designing the impeller for the turbo pump, and if you're not aware, like the turbo pump is arguably the most complicated part of a rocket engine, the one where everybody struggles, and if you can help it, some designs omit it entirely and just use like pressurized tanks, because you're talking about a pump that has to spin at crazy speeds and move gallons per second of propellants. It's a very, very hard engineering problem built into an already very hard engineering problem. So their original like impeller design, he said something like, it looked good on the computer. When they did it in CAD, it was like, yeah, this works great. This will be fine. And then like when they went out to actually have it manufactured, first of all, having it manufactured externally was like already a no-go. They were talking something like $18,000 per impeller. And they knew they were going to have to go through several revisions of it, and they're going to blow a couple of them up too. Let's be realistic. And even if the cost wasn't the big factor, because I mean they got more money than most if they're launching rockets. The big problem was the turnaround to make one of these things. They were talking months to turn around a new design, and they said it's just not going to work as they're working on their engine and they're making tweaks. Like it would take forever. So they brought that capability in-house, and they actually leased a mill, and they hired a machinist, and they're like, okay, now you just handle that internally, right? And that's when they realized like their design was perhaps not as manufacturable as they realized. And the machinist, the person who had like the real hands-on knowledge had to be like, no, like you can't do this. Like the clearances are way too small, so I have to use very small bits, and the bits keep breaking, and because of that, it's gonna take too long. So that kind of made them rethink the design based on the machinist's, real world input. And then they said, well, wait a minute, like, we actually don't need so many blades on the impeller. So they said, okay, well, if we drop these blades off, will it make it easier for you to machine? And a part that was, they said, taking a month to produce could then be produced in a matter of days because of just by simplifying it a little bit, but they didn't know until they actually tried to build it, right? So it is kind of interesting in that respect about the assumptions you make. I gotta remember that, like, it looked good on the computer, like it always looks good on the computer, right? But then when you actually have to make it and you realize like, oh wow, like 0.5 millimeter is kind of a tight clearance, isn't it? So, but like I said, super, super fascinating stuff if you're into like the new space. I'm into this, and I've never seen this level of transparency from a company that's actively developing engines and rockets and stuff. And it's just really, really cool to see this. This is like the dream come true. If you ever looked at these rockets flying and you're like, oh, I wonder how they do that. Like, well, this is how they do that, and it's not always perfect, but they're definitely getting there. And I'm even more excited to see what the future for them looks like after seeing what the behind the scenes are and their process.
Yeah, this one's totally out of my wheelhouse, but I agree with you that it's a neat watch, and it's really cool to kind of see what's hard about the problem, because like that's not something I understood before. I don't know anything about rocket engines, so that was actually kind of fun for me. It's striking how a lot of these new space companies all kind of take the same line, and I think it's an Elon Musk line actually, where you try to source some parts and you figure out that they're just too damn expensive for you to get made, and so then you in-house the making of it, right? You like, oh well, we can't get these made for any reasonable price, so we'll just make them ourselves and, try to do it. And then, like you say, they kind of internalize the learning from that. And I think that's been one of the real big successes of SpaceX along the way, is that they could try to get other systems that would work right, but they would be outrageously expensive. When, at the end of the day, they're just made out of metal. It's just carefully machined metal. And if you can do the carefully machining, you can take that cost internally, but B, you can figure out how to make it cheaper and figure out how to make it more efficiently. And like that story with the tolerance on the impeller, that's the sort of thing you can only learn if you are doing it yourself, and you don't learn that if you're just like outsource it to the highest bidder.
You're absolutely right about that. There is definitely stories from like the early SpaceX where like they would say, okay, well, we need this valve, and they'd get a quote for it, and then once they realized that SpaceX was building rockets, all of a sudden they're like, oh well, no, like now there's a different price, because there's kind of like this built-in like price gouging in the aerospace industry that's just the way things were always done, right? When you had players like Boeing and stuff, and NASA was writing blank checks. Like money was no object. There's so many stories about how like, to go back to switches, like individual switches on like the space shuttle control panel are like $800-900 for like a toggle switch. Like, why is a toggle switch $900? Because it was going in the space shuttle, and like whatever company was making that knew it was going in the space shuttle, so you could charge them $900, and NASA was going to pay it. And SpaceX ran into a lot of that early on. And listen, some of it's legit, right? Like some of it you do need to have higher tolerances and that kind of stuff. Like it's not all made up, but there's definitely some things that didn't need to be so expensive, so they would internalize that, cut that cost. It's certainly worked really well for them. I should also mention that Ryan is a former SpaceX engineer also, so he's kind of bringing some of that experience to ABL. And one of the other things that was cool too, he mentions that, and again, SpaceX did this, I think all the companies did this, like NASA has incredible amounts of raw data on like what materials do well in high temperatures and what ones don't, and like what lubricants you can use. And like and he talks about this and there's just pages and pages of charts and spreadsheets that like just talk about stuff like that. And it's not like a recipe for building a rocket engine, but it's very helpful to have, like, because it can cut out a lot of wasted time, so you're not going down an avenue with the wrong metal used in your bearings or whatever, so it is really cool that this information is out there. And then this is stuff that dates back to, like the space race. And that does give these new space companies a considerable leg up. But then, of course, that's like what NASA is supposed to do. They, they do research with, the American taxpayers' money, and they make it publicly available, and it helps the next generation, right? So it's really cool to see that happening. And we of all people, know about that, like sharing information and explaining how you did something to help the next person is kind of the thing we're about, right? So It's cool to see this happen, not just at the makerspace level, but at the actual, aerospace company level.
My first quick hack this week comes from Ultimate. This is 3D printed fidget knife, snaps back and forth all day long. This is just such a sweet little mechanism. It's a switch that when you flick it one way, a spring-loaded thing happens, and when you flick it the other way, the spring-loaded thing happens in reverse. Deceptively simple, but a really cool mechanism, and I just enjoyed watching the video. Next up, much faster, cold brew coffee through cavitation is a research project by Dr. Francisco Trujillo of University of New South Wales, Sydney. His lab has basically taken apart an espresso machine and added an ultrasonic transducer into it to wiggle the coffee basket back and forth. And so he runs cold water through there, and because it's being ultrasonically wiggled, it extracts fast enough that he can get a cold brew coffee, which would otherwise take overnight to push through in like 3 minutes or something. I think the pursuit of strange coffee brewing methods will never end. A quick note, Jenny List wrote up Your Pi from Anywhere, which details how the Raspberry Pi Connect works. This is coming from Raspberry Pi themselves. It's a neat feature. It's kind of like running VNC on the Pi, except it's using WebRTC. We all face the problem of how to kind of remotely administer little headless single board Linux computers. This is a cool solution to that. And last up, Brian Lunduke, Z80s from the 1980s, had futuristic design, introduced me to the Holborn 9100, which is the space-ageiest looking computer I've ever seen. And if I get to build my own, it's not a cyber deck, it's a cyber desktop. This is what it's going to look like.
Well, for my first quick hack, I have giving your KiCad PCB repository pretty pictures. The definition of a quick hack. This is just a integration that has been developed for both GitHub and GitLab, where every time you push an update to your board, it will regenerate pictures and put them in your documentation, like a render of the board. It's super cool. We've talked about in the past how, good documentation really makes a project stand out, and to be able to automate this so that you always have like nice, fresh, high quality pictures of your PCBs is a really cool project. I'd love to see this, integrated into like the base GitHub website. Man, who knows? Maybe if it gets popular enough, it will be. Next up is ARD-EEG lowers the cost of brain-computer interfaces. This is an Arduino shield that is designed for the Arduino Uno R4 Wi-Fi variant, and it allows you to pull EEG data down from like a dry electrode cap and basically read brainwaves. The interesting thing here is, they use the Wi-Fi version of the Arduino, which is kind of a little uncommon because you need to have complete isolation of this from anything else. You don't want a USB cable snake into your desktop computer, which is plugged into the wall and hooked up to your brain. So it's a interesting approach. It's probably one of the most low cost ones out there. We haven't seen a whole lot of hacking around brain signals yet, and it could just be because the hardware has been too complicated and too expensive to make it possible. So it's going to be interesting to see if projects like this kind of bring more of that to our pages, or maybe that is just somewhere where the average hacker draws the line, messing with their own brain. And last up is fully 3D printed case is stacked high with mini PCs. This one kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the Raspberry Pi versus the N100 computers. This one is a 3D printed case that Jay Dosher made for these little N100 mini computers. This one's the QC12 from B-Link. Okay. They all slot into their own little shelves on the printed case, and there's space in there for the wiring, and it all looks very nice and buttoned up, very futuristic. One of the real standout features, I think, the whole case has kind of been designed around this 13.3-inch high-resolution AMOLED display. So you have like this tower of little computers with this beautiful high-res display on the side that, you could use as like a low-power desktop, or you could use it to show status info from whatever your little computers are doing. A lot of applications for something like this, and it's always cool to see what Jay is working on. We've covered a lot of his projects in the past, and he definitely has a knack for making printed plastic look like something you'd actually like to have on your desktop.
All right, that brings us to our can't miss articles. These are long form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week I wanted to pick Dan Maloney's retro-tectacular How to Not Use Hand Tools. This is a training film from the U.S. Army from 1943, and it is about how to use and maybe even more impressively not use tools. And it starts off with like all of the wrong ways to use a pair of pliers, and using a screwdriver as a chisel, using a pair of needle nose pliers to try to turn a bolt. It's all of these horrible abuses of tools that you will see many people, maybe you've even done it yourself. And some of it hurt a little bit, and I think what I love is Dan's writing about this, where he refers to this as kind of the horrors of tool abuse. And, he mentions what slip joint pliers are actually meant to do, which is turn nuts and bolts from hexagons into circles, et cetera, et cetera. But the video is even funnier, and it's just this kind of deadpan army delivery of these horrible, horrible practices. But they also show, kind of the right way to do with it. What do you do with needle nose pliers, right? You certainly aren't moving around big bolts. You're manipulating small things, right? And so they have them pulling a pin out of something, and they show you what to do with linesman's pliers and et cetera, et cetera. But then they also show a dude, I guess plastic must have been new in 1943, because they're like, just because the handle of your screwdriver isn't made out of wood, it doesn't mean you don't have to be careful about heat. And they just show a guy lighting the handle, it must have been Bakelite, of his screwdriver on fire. And I'm like, thanks a lot. What is there to say about this? I don't think I actually learned anything about the right way to use kind of normal tools. Like, I still don't even know what pliers are good for. Like, needle nose pliers, I understand. And, I have some forceps that I use for similar kind of stuff. But, like, those regular pliers, like, they don't even grip well on things because they don't come together. They actually have... And Dan pointed this out in his write-up. They highlight the parallel jaw pliers, and those are absolutely fantastic. And like Dan, my father had a pair of those, and those are exactly what you need if you need to like pull something out of something, because they have parallel jaws and they grab onto something like the shank of a nail just exactly right. Whereas just normal crappy pliers, they come in at a funny angle, they make very limited contact, and you're just hoping you can pull on the thing hard enough.
I don't know if anything was learned necessarily, but I don't know if that's a huge surprise for a video that came out in 43, right? I'd almost be more, if we came away with new knowledge from this 1943 video, I'd almost be kind of embarrassed that we've been screwing it up for so long, right? But it is cool to see, Dan mentions a little bit of, and like you said with the plastics, like some of the stuff was in its infancy, and, they mentioned like this newfangled Phillips head screwdriver, like these innovations that were ooh and ah back then, and today are kind of, Dan also mentions just like the quality of the tools that they were working with in 43 puts what we have to shame. I mean, there's like screwdrivers they're using. I mean, they're like, a foot and a half long. It looks like it was just like square stock that is flattened, flattened into a screwdriver and put like this wooden handle on. They're just so much, chunkier than, I don't even know where you'd get something like that now. Now we have these tiny little plastic handled things that, bend if you look at them wrong. And these guys were having proper tools for building proper war machines, right? Yeah, they're comically huge. And I wonder, like, was it just from an ergonomics kind of standpoint? If like that's what you're doing all day, you're just turning the screwdriver, and you got to remember this is before any kind of widespread power tool usage, at least on like an assembly line, right? So like if that was this poor sap's job was to turn a screwdriver, I guess you got to give him a giant something he could put his whole body into, instead of this little pocket-sized screwdriver, because the fasteners they're turning aren't even. You would think if you have a 2-foot long screwdriver, you're turning some giant fastener, but it looks like he's doing regular screws, but with this thing as long as his forearm. Just a different time, and I think that's always kind of cool when we do cover these retro videos, just to see how things were done back then. A lot of it was simpler because it had to be, right? They didn't have a lot of the technology that we now take for granted, and it doesn't necessarily mean it was worse, though, right? Like there's we said we didn't learn anything from this one in particular, but it doesn't mean that there aren't still some old school techniques that, might be worth revisiting in the modern shop.
I dare you to watch the first couple minutes of this thing without laughing as the dude tries to use a pair of pliers as a hammer, or as he tries to, what else? Oh, this is one of my favorites, actually, where you take the screwdriver and you need more torque on it. And so you take a pair of pliers and you grab the shank of the screwdriver and you try to twist it around with that. He does that one.
Which is interesting because I've seen modern screwdrivers that like advertise that as a feature too. Like I think even the Klein screwdrivers I have, they even say on the package like, octagonal shank so you can grab it with a wrench or whatever. So I guess at some point that became more acceptable. I don't know.
Maybe it is, yeah.
Or maybe it was just the fact that he was using pliers or something to do it.
He was using, just sketchy pliers to grab it and slip.
Oddly enough, that one was, even though the screwdriver he had previously looked like a square fire poker, I think this one actually is round. So maybe, I guess that was what they were saying, like, don't try to grab a round tool with pliers. Well, not to pump up Dan too much this week, but I also picked a Dan Maloney piece. This one is The Computers of Voyager. I couldn't not. Like, this was such a cool write-up, and I know that he put a lot of work into this, and, I mean, he's been talking about this for, seems like months, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you know, he mentions in the write-up that he went on this, like, personal quest to try to find a lot of these original documents, you know, like we were just talking, you know, that's kind of what NASA does, right? They build these things, they document them, and you're supposed to be able to say, hey, you know, how did the Voyager work? And he found it was not as easy as kind of we all assumed. I think when he kind of pitched this, we all were like, oh, yeah, no problem. You'll be able to find, like, all the documentation. It'll be easy. The reality is a little bit different. I guess you could probably attribute that to just the age of Voyager and, you know, the lack of digitization on some of these things. You know, Dan mentions in there that he was looking for, you know, physical documents, and he tracked down like this one library that had them, and, you know, he was, you know, willing to make the trip, but then they said, well, you know, we're renovating or something, so you can't get to them right now. Like, this was like some Indiana Jones level of research to try to find these, you know, original firsthand documents that just apparently aren't online anywhere, you know. And it was kind of a, you know, that part alone was an interesting reminder that not everything is a Google search away. We kind of take that for granted these days, where we can just find anything on the internet, but there is stuff that has never made the leap to digital. And you know, I should know better. My mother is actually a historian, and we've gotten into this argument before where I've told her, like, you know, why hold original manuscripts? Like, everything's digitized. And, you know, the reality is that they're not, right? Like, there's a small fraction of stuff that was super important that got digitized, and the rest of it is lingering in some library drawer, you know, turning into dust because only 1 in 500 people actually know it's there. This was kind of a crossover episode between all the things my mother tells me and Hackaday. So if there's any old documents out there you're interested in, you know, go out there and look for them before they become literally lost to time. That's half of it. The half of it is his journey to try to get some of this documentation and do what he could working around these limitations. And then the other is, you know, just kind of a deep dive into, like, the tech of Voyager. And I think it's fascinating because we all know Voyager, right? We've written about Voyager plenty of times. Voyager's been obviously in the news recently with the issues that they had. It's not super well known, you know. I mean, from a technical level, you know, you could go on, you know, look up the space shuttle, and there's like infinite resources online about how every, you know, nook and cranny of that was designed and works. And then you can find all kinds of documentaries and all kinds of stuff. But this Voyager, part of it is maybe just because it was so early and they didn't know. I mean, who could have known, right? That Voyager would have such a voyage, for lack of a better term, right? Like, I don't think in their wildest of imaginations they thought when they launched Voyager that people would still be talking about it in 2024. So maybe there wasn't that. You know, no one thought to take it that serious, and no one thought to document it, you know, early on. Because, you know, Dan kind of goes into details here that I've certainly never heard about before or seen anywhere, you know, about like the lessons learned from the earlier Pioneer probes and some of the technology that made that leap over, and how Voyager's like the first spacecraft that used, you know, distributing computing, or what we would call now to be distributing computing. I don't know what the term would have been back then, but, you know, he uses multiple computers and they all talk to each other, and there, you know, there's the redundancy in there, and there's a lot of stuff that, you know, was firsts. And it's just, you know, really cool to look into these things they were doing, breaking so much new ground. And then to still have it kicking around out there and still doing its thing, and hopefully will for many more years to come. I think, right, they say at least till 2030s, I think they said it's probably going to have power. I think that's the ultimate limiting factor, is they said the power produced by the RTGs. But yeah, it's really cool if you're into, like, you know, the vintage technology, or you're into space. I mean, this is a fantastic read. And, you know, they don't make them like they used to.
Yeah, right. No, I love Dan's backstory here, and we've gotten a little more of it behind the scenes, I think, than he lets on here, but not much more either. I think it's pretty solid. But this, like, his search for the lost manuscript that's in this one library in, like, Wichita State University, is awesome. But then the best part is that he called up the folks at JPL to ask them if they had it, and they're like, no. But if you get it, get us a copy. We'd love to see it. I think that's absolutely hilarious. But then he does do fairly well with kind of digging into the computer and the computers, I guess. Like you said, it's a system of 3 computers. And so one does the science, one does the antenna pointing, and the other does the communications and kind of organizing the other 2. And it's a real different situation from previous NASA projects where they really were just kind of run this sequence of actions when this happens. And here it's doing a little bit more, of what we think of as computing rather than just kind of, I don't know, state machine or something. I think that's neat. The thing I didn't know at all is that it used plated wire memory. And I went down that rabbit hole. There's a link for it here, but you can look that up on your own. It's like core memory, except it used wires that had it's a coating of nickel and iron around a copper wire. And so they have different magnetic properties. And it's the same as with magnetic core memory, they're inducing magnetic moments in this funny wire, and because it's different in the radial direction as in the cross-sectional direction, you can use this to store bits of information in its magnetization domains. It's one of these other fundamental pre-silicon memory ideas, and it's really interesting to see, and I kind of dug into that for a little bit. And this stuff is apparently running in 2 places right now. One is some museum in Germany where they have some old computers running it, and the other is on the edge of our solar system in Voyager, like however many millions and millions of miles away. And it's just too funny to think of this old obsolete technology being used in 2 incredibly different places.
Speaking to like the availability of these documents and the search, like there's already in the comments become this like distributed effort where other people are now trying to get a hold of this stuff and making calls. And somebody was like, well, I've been looking for this other weird document, and like the stuff Dan is looking for is like in box 35 of this collection, and this other document is like in box 37. So like there's a lot of very rare early space documents in the same place, like for whatever reason. So now there's multiple people who are saying, well, I'll take a ride out there if they'll let me do it, and I'll digitize it. And somebody is like, well, maybe we can get some money together. So this is turning into like a really awesome, cool, we might actually be able to find some of these documents and get them digitized and put them up on Internet Archive or something for the future. So I think that'd be a really cool kind of, bookend for this story, is that, Dan had all this trouble finding this stuff and maybe was able to get the ball rolling to make it more accessible, and so that in the future it isn't so hard to find out. Does it get more historically significant than Voyager, right? Like this is stuff that should be available. So yeah, it'll be really cool to see how this pans out. And Dan does mention at the end, like he didn't give up by any stretch. He's still working on this, and he's still trying to make calls and see what can happen. So definitely something to keep an eye on going forward.
And that wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you'd like to follow the links or drop us a comment, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And if you see anything cool or do anything cool, email us at tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep on hacking.
How is it possible that I just flipped? Man, entropy's weird.
Sorry, I was actually looking for that coin. Then I was gonna start flipping it to see
if yours comes up all zeros.
Right? Like to see if it's actually out of balance or something.
My first hack this week.
Do I have a segue? No, I don't have a segue.
No.
No,
we don't do segues.
We don't need no segue. What do I know? I only edit the website. Yeah, I think that's good.
Cool.